People connected to the Clintons' scandals didn't just lose their jobs or reputations, they lost their lives in number. Once you see the pattern, my friends, you cannot unsee it. From Arkansas to D.C., witnesses, whistleblowers, and insiders just kept turning up dead. Car crashes, plane crashes, suicides, none of them added up. They formed the most infamous rumor of the 1990s, the Clinton body count. Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Checho, and today I am very excited to finally be bringing you episode 5 of the Bush-Clinton crime family dynasty saga that we are putting on. We've titled this one Scandal, Blackmail, and the Security State, the Ascension of Bill Clinton. Buckle up, it's going to be a fun ride. The train that never stopped. Their names were Don Henry and Kevin Ives. Two boys on the track, side by side, half covered by a green tarp. The train came barreling down and fast, 6,000 tons of steel. The conductor saw something, and he leaned on the whistle. It shrieked like a siren. The boys never moved. The impact, as you can imagine, or maybe as you've heard, was brutal. Their bodies were dragged and torn apart. The official story we were fed? Simple. They'd smoked too much pot. They passed out from it. A tragic accident. Right. But there was nothing simple about it. Not the injuries, not the missing evidence, not the way the case was handled. Because this wasn't just small-town tragedy, my friends. This was Arkansas we're talking about. Remember Arkansas? We've been talking extensively about it in this series, where every mistake seems to protect the same people, where a governor built his power on controlling the narrative at every turn. Many of you have heard of the boys on the tracks, and this is what that legend is of. So what really happened that night? And why did so many people who tried to answer that question end up in a body bag? This was way more than two boys on a railroad. It was a cover-up that stretched from Little Rock to Washington, D.C. Because once the machine starts moving, once the train leaves the station of lies, there is no stopping it. So let's back up. How did we get here? Bill Clinton didn't come out of nowhere. By Bush, by Langley, by a web of pipelines moving money, drugs, and weapons in plain sight. In the previous 4 episodes, we watched how this pipeline spread from Dallas to Vietnam, from the jungles of Central America to the airstrips of Mena, Arkansas. Every scandal we traced, every body that dropped, pointed to the same lesson. Corruption wasn't the exception, it was the infrastructure. If you're just joining us for this episode, I encourage you to please press pause, go back. This is the 5th chapter in this story, and the pieces only make sense when you look at this whole entire criminal machine. Because as I've said, Clinton wasn't just some outsider who stumbled into power. No. Clinton was the next piece on the board, groomed, tested, and ready to play the role the machine had waiting for him. Because once Billy reached the governor's mansion, Arkansas wasn't just a state anymore. It was the proving ground. And here's where the infamous body count began. Cause of death, controlled. You know, people say that politicians get away with murder, but they don't usually mean it literally. But if they did, if a governor really wanted to, the last thing that he'd want is, some independent investigator digging through the evidence, He'd want the opposite, of course. A system where every suspicious death, every contested autopsy, every inconvenient fact had to pass through one office, one chain of command, one person he controlled. And that is exactly what Slick Willie did and what he built in Arkansas. Clinton took the state medical examiner's office, the place that decides how someone died, very important place, particularly in Arkansas at that time, and he nested it inside the state crime lab. A crime lab whose director, of course, he appointed. A lab with no independent review board, no outside oversight, no mandatory second opinions at all. From autopsy table to final report, the trail stopped at the governor's desk. And under Bill Clinton, by the way, I learned this from my friend David Icke, who's been on my show twice. If you have not seen those 2 episodes, my God, you should go back and watch those. Those are some of my most downloaded episodes and watched episodes. Under Billy, Arkansas quietly changed the death classification process, making the crime lab director the final arbiter of manner of death. How bloody convenient. If this man ruled it an accident, it was an accident. If he said it was a suicide, it was a suicide. There was no external review unless the lab allowed it. Do you think the lab allowed a lot of external reviews? When you hear some of the details, you're going to know that they absolutely did not and could not. In most states, my friends, that kind of power is split. Public health here, independent commissions here. Not in Arkansas. Clinton concentrated it. And at the heart of it all, he placed a man whose name you'll never forget after this episode, Fahmy Malak. Malak wasn't board certified. In fact, he failed the exam twice. His autopsies, to say the very least, were riddled with mistakes so basic, they sounded like parody. And I mean literal parody. Wrong organs weighed, gunshot wounds missed, causes of death that defied physics and biology. I've put together a little highlight reel for you that I've been waiting 5 episodes to share with you. Just for example, some of Malak's incredible, outstanding, and uncanny work. In 1982, a man's body was found riddled with 5 bullets, and it was ruled, can you guess, a suicide. No, I'm serious. These are real cases. In 1985, a guy with 4 gunshot wounds to the chest, suicide. True story. In 1986, a man was found shot in the head. His death was ruled an accidental drowning. This is part of a laundry list of cases that I could spend an hour reading you examples like this. And I'll tell you what, one worse than the other, one more unbelievable than the other. This is what was going on in Arkansas under Bill Clinton. It is just, it's unbelievable that this is actually true. Just how criminal this man and his family and his associates were. I mean, he even twisted cases of actual suicide. There's a man hospitalized for clinical depression. He was found hanging in the shower. And when the wife sued for negligence, sued the hospital, Malak said the guy had actually asphyxiated himself while masturbating. No, I'm serious. That's how he got them out of the lawsuit. He changed the ruling. He changed his own ruling and said that actually he didn't die of suicide. He asphyxiated himself while masturbating. Here's the craziest ruling of all. You ready? A guy he said died from ulcers turned out to have been decapitated with a sharp knife. I'm laughing because it's absurd. It's insane that this is true. It is absolutely incredible. It is mind-blowing that all of these are actual literal cases under Clinton's watch. The Arkansas Times actually ran a headline calling him, and I quote, the state medical examiner who couldn't tell the truth. That's one way to put it. On the stand, he'd been accused of lying about evidence, tampering with exhibits, and manufacturing convictions. But of course, as you can tell, that's not all he was up to. There was even an activist group formed to get him out, victims of Malak's infuriating testimonies and rulings. Listen to this. It was called Victims of Malak's Infuriating Testimony. Vomit. That was the acronym for the group. Like, you can't make this shit up. I swear to God. And still, of course, he kept his job. He was very important. He even lied about his credentials, testifying under oath 3 times that he was board certified before he actually passed the exam in 1985, the same year the Bears won the Super Bowl, if memory serves me. So why did Clinton protect him? that question should probably already have started to answer itself, but this is where it gets personal. Are you ready? So back in 1981, Malik issued a ruling that kept a nurse out of legal trouble in a patient's death. That nurse was already under scrutiny for another patient that had died. And you know who that nurse was? Bill Clinton's mother. After Malik did that, he was untouchable. He was the anointed one. True story. Now, no matter how outrageous this man's rulings were, no matter how much the public outraged, Clinton shielded him at every turn. He even found him another state job when the heat got too high. And that's essentially how it worked in Arkansas. When the man with the scalpel worked for the man in the mansion, nothing and no one could touch them. It was a perfect system, airtight to bury the truth, until the night one case roared out of nowhere. And this case hit like a freight train. We're back to the boys on the tracks. Let's get into it. Now, many of you have caught wind of this and heard of this. And this was a national headline at the time. But of course, Bill Clinton was transitioning by the time it hit the public's eyes into the White House. So there was a lot of power behind keeping this story quiet. I recommend a fantastic documentary called The Clinton Chronicles, which is still unbelievably available to watch for free on YouTube. The truth is not hiding, my friends. So back to the boys, these poor boys. Now, by the time the train screeched to a stop in Saline County, there was no saving these boys. Two teenagers, Don Henry and Kevin Imes, they lay across the rails, a .22 rifle placed beside them. Hours earlier, they'd left Don's house to go spotlighting, which is like night hunting or night, watching. You're keeping an eye out for the deer. And they went towards the tracks. 3 hours later, the crew of a mile-long freight saw something very wrong. The boys stretched out, arms at their sides, a green tarp covering them. They wailed on the horn. The whistle screamed. The tarp did not budge. Nothing moved. The boys were motionless. The first story out of Malik's office was very neat and tidy. He said they'd smoked the equivalent of 20 joints and passed out, and they never heard the train. It was an accident. Case closed. The hell were they doing with a tarp on them then? What, did they get cold? That's literally what he told the parents and what they announced to the public. Can you imagine? So the details refused to stay buried, obviously. The tarp seen by the crew vanished from the record. Of course, it had massive evidence on it. Neither boy owned a tarp, okay? So obviously, this was a problem. No wonder it disappeared. Parents who knew their sons were not smoking weed or spaced out, they forced the state to reopen the case. The bodies were exhumed. Now there's trouble. The second autopsy tore the first one to absolute shreds. Don's shirt had been cut. He'd been stabbed in the back, okay? Kevin's skull showed massive blunt force trauma. Toxicology reports? 1 to 3 joints max. Both boys were dead long before the train ever touched them. That should come as no surprise to you. So the question is, what did they stumble into? What did these poor boys see that cost them their life? See, the stretch of rail wasn't just a shortcut through the woods. It sat on a corridor locals had already been whispering about. Night drops tied to the Mena pipeline. People could hear the planes coming and going. Low-flying, strobeless planes. Packages staged near the tracks for pickup. People have eyes. People can see. Cash, massive cash, and product moving in the dark while the state looked the other way. Just 3 weeks before the murders, a man in military fatigues was seen near the tracks. When a local cop questioned him, he opened fire and vanished into the woods. The night the boys died, a similar figure was spotted again, moving toward the same stretch of rail. Was this security for a drop? That's what it seems like, doesn't it? Let's listen to what Linda Ives has to say.
Clinton had integrated a number of corrupt cops, judges, and politicians into high-level positions to ensure the continued success of the drug smuggling, money laundering operations. All was going well until a fateful night in the fall of 1987.
On August 22nd, 1987, Kevin had spent the night with his friend Don Henry. They left Don's home around 12:30 or quarter to 1 on the 23rd of August in early morning hours, and the next thing we knew, they had been run over by a train. There seems to be a small airstrip in the area. There have been sightings and reports of small airplanes flying very low with lights off in the area. I believe they saw something they shouldn't have seen. 3 weeks later, their deaths were ruled accidental by the state medical examiner, Fahmy Malek, and we disagreed with that ruling because we thought the evidence pointed to homicide. At that point, we had a lot of questions and no answers, and the facts didn't add up to what he was telling us, so we decided to get a second opinion and met with resistance from all fronts, both with our local law enforcement, with the state crime lab, with everybody that we turned to. We obtained court orders requesting samples of everything that the crime lab had for a second opinion, and Fahmy Malek resisted court orders. He refused to obey them.
Ultimately, it was proven that Don Henry had been stabbed in the back and Kevin Ives' skull had been crushed prior to the placement of their bodies on the railroad tracks. However, Malek stood by his ruling that the boys had simply fallen asleep on the tracks. Malek had been kept in office at the insistence of Governor Clinton for a number of years, despite vigorous public outcry to have him removed.
Now, the second autopsy in and of itself should have blown this case wide open. Instead, it blew the circle of danger wide open. If Don and Kevin were murdered for what they saw, someone very powerful had something very big to hide. And in Arkansas, at this time, anyone who got too close to the truth found themselves in the crosshairs. Witnesses lined up, and then they started to fall. You know, you've heard people talk about hashtag Clinton body count. I have a book written under that title. You heard chants of people screaming, lock her up, lock her up. I remember hearing that and being like, wow, these guys are all crazy. What do they want to lock Hillary up for? I had no idea. And most people probably don't. At least half the country doesn't. Or maybe they just don't want to know. But listen to what happened to the witnesses as they tried to bring the truth to bear. Keith Coney told his friends what had happened. Days later, he died in a high-speed motorcycle chase. Keith McCaskill warned his family that he was a dead man. Soon after, his body was found stabbed more than 100 times. Greg Collins spoke to investigators and then turned up shot in the face. Daniel Booney Barden, who reportedly had a lot of inside knowledge about what had happened, just disappeared without a trace. Jeff Rhodes was shot, his body burned, dumped in a landfill. As you can imagine, many others soon recanted after they had late-night visits from men nobody could later identify. There was nothing coincidental about any of this. This wasn't bad luck or misfortune. This was a cleanup operation, obviously on the same par as what they did after JFK was shot. This is the point where rumors start to harden into pattern, and pattern starts to look like policy, criminal policy at that. At the choke point of all of this stood prosecutor Dan Harmon, and instead of seeking justice, he controlled it and manipulated it and sidetracked it. Years earlier, Dan had proved his value during the Saline Memorial Hospital scandal. Public funds skimmed into a slush account for some of Bill Clinton's favorite party tricks: booze, blow, prostitutes. Now, things that kept the local power structure loyal. The capstone of all this was, of course, a party house wired with hidden cameras, a honeypot. When investigators seized the footage, Harmon took custody. And what he held was the kind of viewing material that would have made Diddy proud. Reels and reels of powerful men in very compromising situations. As you can imagine, those tapes never saw the light of day. They became leverage. And from then on, Harmon wasn't the prosecutor. He was Arkansas's insurance policy, my friends. Imagine if Epstein had run his operation not from the shadows, but from the courthouse with the state's blessing. Everyone's like, wait, isn't that what he did? Yeah, for the longest time, but yeah. So when Don and Kevin's case threatened to expose the Mena to Saline drug and money pipeline, Harmon wasn't the fix, do you understand? He was the firewall. We have credible allegations that even place him near the tracks on that night. Allegations never tested in a courtroom, built to protect the likes of him. This is a federal umbrella we are talking about, my friends. In case you're thinking that, what happens in Arkansas stays in Arkansas, think again. Where did Bill go after Arkansas? As we've shown you in every episode, the corruption ran straight up the chain, all the way to Washington. Bush had his bases covered, make no mistake about it. Gene Duffy, the head of Arkansas's drug task force, said every serious lead pointed to the same circle of traffickers protected by political muscle. For saying so, she had to flee the state with a price on her head. Listen to her.
No idea just how dangerous certain elected officials thought me to be until a brutal media campaign was launched against me. For months, there were daily allegations of everything from misspending funds to ordering illegal arrests. Every attempt was made to keep me from running the drug task force. We were even shut down completely for several weeks during a bogus state police investigation. In spite of crippling disruptions, the task force was making significant discoveries about drug trafficking in central Arkansas, some of which led to the very people who were conducting the massive media crusade against me. We discovered that drug trafficking in Arkansas was linked to government officials in frightening proportions. A great number of people came to me with testimony about astonishing criminal activity of very high-level public officials. Many were willing to testify before the federal grand jury.
Robert Govar and Chuck Banks were the U.S. attorneys for the District of Arkansas at that time. I was subpoenaed to testify on behalf of the drug trafficking and the cartel, more or less is what it was, that had to do with Dan Harmon and what I call company, because there are there's a whole bunch of them that are involved. I was asked quite in depth about the drug trafficking that went on with Dan Harmon, Mr. Clinton, Roger Clinton.
Although there was an abundance of evidence and word kept reaching me from members of the grand jury that they were ready to indict, no indictments came. Mr. Govar also insisted that he was ready to prosecute at least 2 key figures, but the holdup was his boss, U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, who repeatedly delayed requests for indictments.
And the men who should have been blowing the whistle, they were the very ones shutting this down. U.S. Attorney Asa Hutchinson turned a blind eye to what could have been the most explosive drug smuggling case in American history, and was later appointed and rewarded, I kid you not, as the nation's drug czar. He was made head of the DEA. His counterpart, Attorney Chuck Banks, didn't just stall a drug case. He strangled the overlapping murder probe, and Bush moved to make him a federal judge. Good guy. Good guys. The corruption and cleanup in Saline County wasn't just a one-off, my friends. It was a prototype. And when Bill Clinton took that system to Washington, it didn't dissolve in the sunlight. It scaled up and built like a wave. Speaking of waves, let's talk about Whitewater, shall we? Bill Clinton rode a wave of charisma and hope right into the White House. But one ghost from Arkansas followed him, rattling its chains louder with every step. And it wasn't Iran-Contra. It wasn't even Mena. It was Whitewater. Sounds harmless, right? It was a failed Ozarks real estate venture where Marty and Wendy Bird, Bill and Hillary Clinton, partnered with their friends Jim and Susan McDougal to buy land for vacation homes, right? And on paper, it just seemed like a bad investment, right? But when Jim McDougal's savings and loan, Madison Guarantee, collapsed in spectacular fashion, taxpayers ate a $60 million bill. Suddenly, the Clintons weren't just unlucky investors. They became suspects. The investigation spiraled. Fraud, mismanagement, shady loans, you name it. Washington started to smell blood. Whitewater was framed as the first great test of the new presidency, the scandal that might just bring down the Clintons before they could cement their power and fortune. And the media? What do you think the media did? They turned it into a spectacle. Saturday Night Live turned the scandal into a skit. Jay Leno made it a nightly punchline. You guys know who these talk shows work for, right? They're all state-owned and operated. If you didn't learn that in 2020 and 2021, or even before, my God, you got to pull your head out of the sand and start paying attention. None of these shows are legit. The moment they become too legit and they have too much sovereignty, they are ousted. Reporters called it too complicated to follow, like an accounting class that nobody wanted to sit through. In other words, they weren't allowed to talk about it. And if they were supposed to ridicule and make fun of it. And anyone who thought it was legit. Take a listen. Go ahead. Take a listen.
They borrowed $250,000 with their friends, the McDougalls, and formed the Whitewater.
All right. And that was the trick. The Clintons made Whitewater look boring. While the public tuned out, their partners went to prison. And Bill and Hillary walked away tougher, more tested. Can you think of any other scandals that the waters were muddied so incredibly that it was just impossible to keep track? I don't know. Let's see. Charlie Kirk was just assassinated like a week or two ago. And it seems like the same kind of tactics are being employed with this scandal. Muddy the waters at every turn. Tactics. Because Whitewater wasn't the real scandal. It was actually a decoy, a limited hangout. While the press obsessed over land records and loan files, the deeper story, the one tying Arkansas politics to covert money flows, drug trafficking, and Mena, stayed completely buried. Do you understand? Where have we seen that pattern before with Hillary Clinton? The emails and then one misdirection after the next. What you can do safely is always follow the money. If you dig deeper, you'll hit an artery. Arkansas finance, my friends. When Madison Guarantee collapsed, the pressure for an independent investigation grew a lot. Now, enter a man named Robert Fisk. He was appointed by Janet Reno. Independent? Not if he's appointed by Janet. Reno was handpicked on Bruce Lindsay's recommendation. Bruce Lindsay was Clinton's personal fixer, in case you don't know. And Fisk's law firm, it represented the very company that sold McDougal the land at the heart of Whitewater. And that wasn't an oversight. That's called containment, my friends. And yet, even under a hand-picked prosecutor, cracks appeared. In 1988, a transfer of $50 million from the Arkansas Development Finance Authority to the Cayman Islands surfaced in testimony. It was an offshore laundromat hiding inside a state agency. Why weren't we told about this? Then came a man named Dennis Patrick. Dennis was a random small-town clerk, suddenly turned Wall Street whale. Sounds like a few other people I know. Lassiter and Company, remember Lassiter? They ran tens of millions through an account in this guy's name without his knowledge, and then tried to sue him when it all went south. Patrick went public, he testified, he named names. What followed, as you can imagine, was pure Goodfellas. Men with guns, maps of his house, a car full of explosives. He survived 4 separate assassination attempts. Survived. But the message was clear. You stumble onto this pipeline and you'll get buried. Let's talk about one of the most unsung heroes of this entire criminal syndicate. One cannot underestimate the level of involvement that Hillary Clinton had in everything that we are talking about. And believe me, she was involved. None of this, really, truly, none of it could have happened without her. So let's discuss a little bit the Rose Law Firm. We've been discussing it here and there in just about every episode, but there's some things we need to revisit for this one. Behind this pipeline, structuring it, shielding it, making sure the paper trail never saw the light of day, enabling it at every turn, was the absolute catalyst, stood Arkansas's most powerful legal machine, the Rose Law Firm. Okay, Hillary's home base. We're not just talking about drafting contracts here, okay? This was the firewall that was absolutely necessary between dirty money and daylight. At its heart were three names that carried Rose's influence straight into the Clinton presidency. Hillary was the bridge between Rose's contracts and Bill's politics. Webb Hubbell, the bond lawyer, structuring deals that turned public finance into private profit. Okay? So we have Hillary, we have Webb, and the third, Vince Foster, the mentor, the fixer, the man trusted to handle what no one else could. Together, they formed the Rose Triangle, shall we call it, the inner circle that embodied how Arkansas's legal firewall became Washington's political shield. Hubbell even wrote the rules. In 1988, he pushed Arkansas's Ethics in Government Act. God help us all. Sounds very noble if you don't know Arkansas's ethics. You know, accountability, reform. Well, get this, the kicker. The governor, his appointees, and his family were exempt. No shit. Ethics for everyone else, immunity for the Clintons. Classic Rose Law Firm. Slap reform on the label, bury corruption in the fine print. Listen to Webb Hubbell.
The first loan made at ADFA was made to Parkometer, a company called Parkometer. Seth Ward was the owner. As I started looking, I found out that the Secretary-Treasurer was Webb Hubbell. Then I found out Webb Hubbell was Seth Ward's son-in-law. Guess who drafted the legislation creating Act 1062, which created the Arkansas Development Finance Authority? Webb Hubbell. Guess who introduced the legislation to our legislators and got it passed through our House? Webb Hubbell. Guess who got the first loan? Webb Hubbell. Imagine this. Guess who did the audit and the evaluation of the application? Rose Law Firm. You guessed it. Who signed it? Webb Hubbell, Hillary Clinton. You see, that's against the law in Arkansas. You can't investigate yourself when the good faith and credit of the state of Arkansas is involved in a bond issue. He broke the law. Good Lord willing, creek don't rise. Mr. Hubbell will be serving some time in the pen for that one.
Ironically, Webb Hubbell, a senior partner at the Rose Law Firm, was chairman of the Conflicts of Interest Committee at Rose. In 1988, he successfully advanced the Ethics in Government Act, which required Arkansas legislators to report governmental conflicts of interest. Incredibly, this law specifically exempted Governor Bill Clinton, his appointees, and his relatives. Clinton's appointment of Hubbell to the U.S. Justice Department exemplified the administration's total disregard for legal ethics. Hubbell's hasty resignation in March 1994 for overbilling of Rose clients was merely a ploy to remove Hubbell from the limelight before extensive criminal charges could be brought against him.
Rose's client list reads like a greatest hits of scandal, okay? Madison Guarantee, the S&L at the heart of Whitewater. You had ADFA, who we've talked extensively about, the state agency parking millions of dollars offshore. Stevens Incorporated, Arkansas's Wall Street arm tied to the global BCCI laundering scandal. You had Worthen Bank funneling highly questionable loans. And of course, Dan Lassiter, Bill's crony and little bro Roger, Clinton's booger sugar bestie. Through ADFA, more than $600 million in state bonds flowed from Lassiter's firm, even as he was under federal investigation for drug trafficking. Competence did not buy that business. And when Lassiter went to prison, his lieutenant, Patsy Tomason, kept the machine humming. Her reward? A cush White House post, where she'd soon reappear at the center of the body count scandal. Let's talk about Vince Foster, the cleaner who couldn't clean anymore. Okay, when Clinton moved into the White House, he brought his Arkansas machine with him, of course. And at its heart was this man, Vince Foster. He was deputy White House counsel. He was Hillary's mentor, Bill's fixer. Rumors swirled of intimacy beyond the office. Whispers that Chelsea's resemblance to Vince wasn't a coincidence. Gossip, maybe, but perception mattered. He was trusted to keep secrets no one else was allowed to. 6 months into Clinton's presidency, Foster was dead. July 20th, 1993. He was found in Fort Marcy Park. The official story, I'm sure you can guess. Suicide. Gun at his side. Pills in his blood. Stress, depression. It's all too much for him to bear. You know, same story. But the details, of course, never lined up. The investigation was botched, evidence was missing, witnesses contradicted, and inside the West Wing, staffers scrambled to remove files from his office before investigators arrived. Among the first in, Patsy Thomason, the same fixer who once babysat Laster's cocaine empire. She walked out with boxes and boxes, and the contents never resurfaced. Gee, seems to be like a really, really ready and often used playbook with the Clintons, doesn't it? I seem to remember Hillary deleting a lot of emails, smashing a lot of phones with hammers, and really good at that stuff. Naturally, many questions arose. Did Foster know too much about Whitewater? Did he carry secrets from Mena, ADFA, and the Rose Law Firm that wouldn't be and couldn't be allowed to escape? In Arkansas, inconvenient people often turned up dead. Now it was happening in Washington. Vince Foster's death wasn't just a tragedy, okay? It was a signal. The Little Rock machine had scaled, and its first order of business was starting to bury its own. Too much liability. Now we're talking the Clinton body count. Because once you see the pattern, my friends, you cannot unsee it. People connected to the Clintons' scandals didn't just lose their jobs or reputations, they lost their lives in number. From Arkansas to D.C., witnesses, whistleblowers, and insiders just kept turning up dead. Car crashes, plane crashes, suicides. None of them added up. They all only had one thing in common. Shootings with missing evidence. Each case could be written off on its own, but put together, they formed the most infamous rumor of the 1990s, also known as the Clinton body count. So if we start in Arkansas, Jerry Parks, this was Clinton's former security chief, was gunned down in his car, execution style, just months after telling friends that he had a dossier on Bill's activities. I'm sure it was a coincidence. Right. His widow said he warned her that if he ever got killed, it would be because of what he knew about the Clintons. That's what he said. The police chalked it up to road rage, I believe. Yeah. The file on that case disappeared. Shocker. Then to Washington, Ron Brown, Clinton's commerce secretary. He died in a plane crash in Croatia in 1996. Very tragic accident. The headlines told us so. But the Air Force pathologist who examined his body reported a circular wound in Brown's skull, consistent with a gunshot. That testimony, of course, vanished. The crash site was bulldozed before investigators could recover all the evidence. So my question is, does this seem like a crash or a cleanup? We already saw what happened to Vince Foster, who took all the Clinton secrets right to his grave. And then there's Mary Mahoney, a young White House intern, rumored to be ready to testify about Clinton's sexual misconduct. She was found shot to death inside a Georgetown Starbucks. There were 3 employees killed. No money was taken. She just coincidentally was among those murdered in cold blood for no reason. The case was eventually pinned on a petty criminal, but for those of us who had been watching the pattern, it was clear another message was sent, another witness was murdered. But the list didn't stop there, my friends. It wouldn't be legend if it stopped there. No, 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 no. It continued and continued and continued. Okay, we had James McDougal, the Clintons' Whitewater partner. He conveniently died of a heart attack in prison just as he was cooperating with investigators. You all know the CIA busted out a gun at the church committee hearings, right? That was like, I don't know, way back in the early 70s. You know, you think maybe they improved on it? I'm sure they did. There was Ed Willie, a Clinton fundraiser. Must have seen or heard a little too much. He was found shot in the head on the same day his wife alleged that Bill groped her in the Oval Office. What are the odds? What are the odds? Barbara Wise, she was a Commerce Department staffer. She was discovered half naked and bruised in her locked office. What was the cause of death? Never determined. Odd. That's crazy. Never determined. Never quite nailed down how she kicked the bucket, locked in her office like that, bruised up and battered. I have no idea. I just can't figure it out. Better call Bruce Wayne. Paul Wiltshire was a D.C. attorney. He was preparing to testify on the Waco debacle and also on Mena, Arkansas. He turned up dead in his apartment. Kind of reminds me of that poor AI Google whistleblower in his apartment in San Francisco just recently. And these were the high-profile cases, my friends. These were the one that made the headlines. Not to mention, we would need a whole nother special to the string of witnesses who vanished after the boys on the tracks. Arkansas had perfected this kind of cleanup. Do you understand? These were not coincidences. They were operational logic. It was a mix of plausible deniability and raw intimidation that came to be called Arkancide. What a great phrase. Whoever coined that should have won an award. Arkancide. Suicides that look staged, or at least attempt to look staged. Accidents a little too neat. Crashes a little too convenient and coincidental. And the message wasn't just to the victim, you all understand. It was to everyone else. If you talk, you're next. When researchers began tallying it up, okay, the numbers stunned even the skeptics. 40, 50, some claimed more than 80. Too many for chance. This was a pattern written in a blood smear from Arkansas to D.C. But of course, not every cover-up ends with a body in a ditch or a bullet in a park. Sometimes the machine has to send a bigger message, a crisis that is shocking and paralyzing for the public. That also is a great way to leave the truth buried in rubble. Can we think of a few instances right off the top of our heads? I can think of one. Probably not the one you're thinking of. Let's talk about Waco a little bit, shall we? The domestic war machine takes center stage. Waco. Not every silencing came with a single corpse. Some came with napalm and fireballs on live TV. Spring, 1993. 51 days outside a religious compound in Waco, Texas. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms stormed the Branch Davidians. Branch Davidians were a fringe sect, stockpiling guns and preaching end times prophecy. Both those things aren't illegal, last I checked, but just a side note for you. This should have been a contained standoff, but it turned into America's first reality TV show. Tanks, helicopters, armored vehicles, hundreds and hundreds of federal agents. This was very, very highly publicized and very, very highly watched. The Clinton White House inherited Waco just weeks after taking office. So instead of diffusing it, they doubled down. And in my humble opinion, they furthered the agenda of the one world totalitarian government, which truly puppets all of these people and politicians. And they have one end goal in mind, a police state run by a few for the globe. Okay. So General Janet Reno gave the green light for a final assault. For what reason? The official line. Well, we'll just smoke them out for safety since there's children inside. And what America saw as they smoked them out was a televised inferno. CS gas pumped into the compound, armored vehicles ripping through the walls, flames erupting until 76 men, women, and children were burned alive. The press framed it as a cult tragedy, but the optics were a lot bigger. For the first time, Americans saw tanks rolling through their own suburbs. Okay, it wasn't Baghdad, it wasn't Basra, this was Texas. And the lesson was simple. Okay, if the government called you a threat, overwhelming force wasn't just possible, it was going to be inevitable. The children Clinton claimed to protect were gone, but the state had proven its point. Inside Washington, whispers said Reno wasn't the only one pushing. Shocker. Some claim the pressure came straight from Hillary Clinton, eager to end the siege and clear the way for her health care rollout before it was buried under tanks and cultists. Does that sound like something Hillary might do? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. No paperwork proves this, but the rumor fit the pattern. Politics first, people and lives second. Crisis is a weapon. I believe it was Hillary who talked about let no crisis ever go wasted without taking advantage of. So shock as a policy, do you understand? Waco wasn't the end of the playbook. It was just the pilot episode, my friends. Remember I said that. Oklahoma City. Who saw my special on Oklahoma City? It was fantastic. It was truly a dry run for 9/11, and they learned a lot because they completely botched Oklahoma City. Okay, but 2 years later, they ran the script again. This time, the stage was much bigger, the body count was much higher, and the questions were even darker. It was April 19th, 1995, exactly 2 years to the day after Waco's fiery end. A Ryder truck packed with fertilizer tore through the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. And I mean tore through like a giant comet hit the building. A fertilizer truck did this. Right. 168 dead, 19 of them children in a daycare center. This was the deadliest act of domestic terror in American history. And the story the government pushed was quite simple. Timothy McVeigh, a disgruntled veteran, was acting with a very small circle of militia allies, domestic terrorists. Case closed. But if Waco was a shock, Oklahoma City was a smokescreen, my friends. Within hours, witnesses described multiple blasts. You have to go watch my episode on this. It's crazy and very enlightening. Witnesses described multiple blasts. Strange men spotted with McVeigh, unexploded ordnance found inside the building. Yet those leads all, of course, evaporated. All the evidence was seized, sealed, or literally destroyed even before the people were rescued. And the biggest question of all is, why did the FBI rush to cordon off the scene and then bulldoze the building? Why did they rush to wipe away the largest crime scene in America before the public could ever get real answers? What was in the rubble? Records, my friends. Lots of them. Documents from ongoing federal investigations, including cases tied to Whitewater and Mena, all suddenly reduced to ash. To some, the message was clear. Oklahoma City wasn't just about terror, it was a cleanup. A national crisis leveraged to erase the paper trail of Arkansas corruption that was threatening to surface. We could, and I have spent hours unpacking the contradictions and anomalies in this case. We could spend hours unpacking the contradictions, and actually we have. If you want the full rundown of the suspicious details, vanished evidence, unanswered questions, absurd physics, go back and listen to our 2-part series on Oklahoma City and the bombing. It's all there. The names, the affidavits, the testimony, the motive. Everything that never made it past the evening news is contained in those 2 episodes. For our purposes here, Oklahoma City was just the escalation, okay? Waco proved that the government could now roll tanks on its own citizens. Oklahoma City proved that it could bury the truth under concrete dust and call it closure. And underneath both was a bigger design. The machine wasn't improvising, my friends. It was executing a playbook, a totalitarian military state playbook. Each crisis conditioned Americans to accept more surveillance, more military, more government intrusion, always justified as protection. And it's still going on. What do you think happened just now with Charlie Kirk? What's the first thing they tried to do upon his death? Push more online police and just a total infringement of our freedom of speech and just use the crisis as a reason. So this pattern has been going on a very long time. Understand this. What began under Reagan and Bush as a contingency planning for domestic unrest was now being field tested under Clinton, turning federal power inward. Do you understand? They needed precedent after precedent for this. These were tragedies, of course, but they weren't just tragedies. These were trial runs. They were dress rehearsals for the security state that was quietly being built and fed brick by brick, law by law, body by body. How many of you have heard of Rex 84 and Operation Night Train? Ooh, that sounds juicy, doesn't it? What happened at Waco and Oklahoma City didn't come out of thin air. They followed a script, one that had been written years and years earlier and then quietly buried inside the federal government. Gee, that sounds like Operation Northwoods and 9/11, doesn't it? But this time it surfaced by accident. Okay, now last episode we learned how my friend attorney Danny Sheehan and the Christic Institute filed a lawsuit to expose the CIA's guns and drugs pipeline in Central America. The case was mocked, of course, and dismissed, but before it died, Danny dragged something extraordinary into the daylight, a federal blueprint for domestic crackdowns. And it was called Rex 84. God bless Danny Sheehan. The man's a national treasure. Everyone should follow him and his work and watch every interview he's ever given, including his interview with me. That's all I'll say about Danny. I love it. It was Rex 84. It was a readiness exercise 1984. Boy, oh boy. We're really on the nose now, aren't we? The scenario was chillingly specific. Now listen to this. If the U.S. Attorney General declared a national emergency, the government would round up 500,000 undocumented Central Americans and at least 4,000 American citizens labeled national security threats. And they would detain them at 22 military bases converted into FEMA-run concentration camps. No, that's not a movie pick. No, that's not a pitch for a Netflix show. That was an actual plan. Yeah. Now, Rex 84 had a twin, Operation Night Train. That exercise drilled the mechanics, okay? How fast can mass arrests happen? How fast could troops be deployed on U.S. streets? And how constitutional rights could be shelved overnight under the banner of continuity of government and, of course, national threats. Daniel Sheehan's case didn't go anywhere. His warnings were laughed at, mocked, but the documents were prophetic. Everything we later saw in Iran-Contra in those files and the domestic model the Reagan-Bush crowd called contingency reappeared a decade later under Clinton and was rebranded as law and order, field-tested in crisis. Do you understand? If this sounds uncomfortably familiar, that's because the scripts never went away. They just keep using them over and over and over again. The labels change, sure. Illegal immigrants, domestic extremists, terror suspects. But the playbook, my friends, is always the same. Always. Waco and Oklahoma City weren't improvisations. They were applications, and Clinton's role wasn't to stop it. It was to codify it. That was Bush's little lapdog trained well. What do you think these people are about? Speaking of codifying, this is the domestic war machine we are talking about, my friends, and this is how it goes. By the mid-1990s, the trial runs were over. Okay, Waco had shown that the federal government was more than willing to use military force against our own civilians. Oklahoma City had shown that it could wrap a cover story in patriotism and bury deeper questions under the rubble. But the real legacy wasn't in smoke or the headlines, my friends. It was in the laws that followed. Always in the laws that follow. Always. When you want to learn the true motive for one of their incredible, atrocious catastrophes, be it an assassination, be it a terror attack, always look to the legislation that follows. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA. The name sounds great. Sounds like justice, right? Of course it does. It's Orwellian. Always. Double think, double speak. The reality was something very, very different. The act gutted habeas corpus. It stripped federal courts of the ability to review wrongful convictions, and it expanded the death penalty. It handed the executive branch sweeping new powers, all justified by the specter of a domestic threat, domestic terror. In effect, what Reagan and Bush had floated as a contingency in Rex 84, Clinton codified as statute. In an emergency in air quotes for everyone listening, constitutional safeguards could be bypassed. Understand? Haven't you all read William Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse? He talks about this. He's been talking about it for decades. Clinton also, by the way, locked in the FEMA model. Remember Rex 84's blueprint, military bases, mass detentions, FEMA would be put in charge. You know, all the conspiracy theorists talk about this, and y'all think that we're just crazy. Under Clinton, FEMA was no longer just disaster relief or disaster response. It was folded into continuity of government planning with the authority to coordinate state-level militarization. What had been hypothetical under Reagan was becoming standing doctrine. And the build-out didn't stop there, my friends. Clinton blurred the bright line of posse comitatus, which is a Latin phrase, which I probably terribly mispronounced, and I apologize to you about that. We'll spell it on the screen for you, okay? The military was never supposed to act as domestic police. Do you understand? But the Clinton mainstreamed these exceptions. That's why they were so widely televised. He championed joint task forces that fused FBI, DEA, and even military-trained units with local law enforcement, effectively federalizing and militarizing policing under the language of wars, air quotes for my listeners, on drugs and gangs and terror. And if you've been listening to me and following along, you know who was actually responsible for all the drugs, gangs, and terror: the United States government. And then came the 1033 program. Have you heard about this? Let me tell you. So Pentagon warehouses were emptied into small-town America. You know, M16, assault rifles, night vision gear, armed personal carriers, even grenade launchers. Local cops, once meant to protect and serve, now rolled through neighborhoods like occupation troops. The war abroad had come home. And here's the point, my friends. Once you normalize pointing an M16 at your own citizens, you've crossed the Rubicon. Do you understand? The wars on drugs and terror were not metaphors anymore. They were marching orders. A standing domestic war machine, written into law, armed out of Pentagon stockpiles, just waiting for the next crisis to be activated. And who do you think is going to orchestrate and plan and execute the next crisis? Who do you think? Now, if Clinton could do that at home, with hardly a peep from the press, imagine what happened when he took the same machine overseas. The Arkansas playbook, my friends, didn't stop at the water's edge. It scaled up to empire. And empire doesn't always march with tanks now. Remember, sometimes it signs a treaty. Speaking of treaties, the globalist expansion, NAFTA. My friends, the first move was economic. George H. W. Bush signed it in 1992. Bill Clinton sold it in 1993. Two parties, the uniparty. One agenda, not left versus right. Continuity. Criminal continuity. On paper, NAFTA promised prosperity. Don't they always? In practice, it gutted U.S. factories, offshored union jobs, and flooded Mexico with subsidized U.S. corn riddled with glyphosate. Small farmers collapsed, millions were displaced, migration surged, of course, and the exact national emergency that Rex 84 had gamed out years earlier came into fruition. And right on cue came the cure. Militarized borders, detention centers, police turned soldiers, crisis engineered, response pre-written. Problem, reaction, solution. Should we talk about Haiti? We can't. We have to have a whole other episode on Haiti, but let's just mention it in context here. We'll get into Bill's later entanglements, Bill and Hillary's later entanglements with Haiti in more detail, perhaps as a side episode. Okay, so Mexico was just the warm-up, all right? Next stop, the Caribbean. You know, most couples honeymoon in Hawaii or Paris, don't they? Or they used to. Bill and Hillary went to Haiti on Citibank's dime. It wasn't romance, of course, it was networking. Citibank ran Haiti's finances like a company town. And instead of beaches, the Clintons ended up at a voodoo ritual. Drums, trances, spirits. Hillary later bragged about it. You think I'm making this up? Cultural tourism or initiation? You decide. Either way, it set the tone. And there's been a lot of dark, swirling rumors about Hillary, hasn't there? I won't even say it. I don't want to get this video any more suppressed than it's going to be. Fast forward, candidate Clinton blasted Bush for backing Haiti's junta. President Clinton flipped U.S. troops, rushed in, and restored democracy. Oh, God, Haiti is such a better place now since we did that. Aristide returned on a leash. Security forces rebuilt Washington. The economy cracked open for big agriculture. Cheap Arkansas rice flooded Haiti, wiping out local farmers. Dependency sold as democracy. And who got rich? The Clintons. What Clinton perfected in Little Rock, control the institutions, siphon the spoils, he exported to Port-au-Prince. And honestly, this was just the surface, my friends. The Clintons' strange entanglement with Haiti goes on for decades. Earthquakes, stolen aid money, and even orphan trafficking scandal, which I know many of you have heard of. We're going to do a whole nother episode on that. But Haiti was just the warm-up, my friends. Once the Clintons showed they could pull off regime change in America's backyard, the same machine turned toward bigger prey, the Middle East. And that's where the game got deadly serious. All right. Speaking of the Middle East, you already know the playbook here. Every one of you should know the playbook. All right. In the 1980s, Washington was secretly selling arms to Iran. We've gone over this extensively. Skimming the profits to fund the Contras and running the deals through Israel as the cutout. That's the Iran-Contra we covered in massive detail in episode 4. But here's a shocker. It wasn't just Iran. The same networks were cutting deals with Iraq too. And America, lo and behold, was fueling both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, funneling arms and laundering funds through shady networks like the ones uncovered in little old Arkansas. And the biggest beneficiary of that chaos, can you guess? Israel. The one regional power that wanted Tehran and Baghdad boxed in at the same time, of course. So by the 90s, Clinton rebranded it as, quote, dual containment. And it wasn't homegrown. It was Likud's playbook, my friends, straight from Bibi Netanyahu's inner circle. Bush Sr. had talked normalization, but Clinton's team locked in permanent paralysis. Behind the scenes, the same covert networks kept humming, okay? funding factions, arming radicals, leaving vacuums for Al-Qaeda. All of these things were fertile ground, deliberately planted and done so that these terror networks could take root. And Clinton didn't end the Iran-Iraq machine. He institutionalized it. And this marked the birth of the neocons, not yet in power, but infecting the bloodstream of Washington, including Clinton's own inner circle. And then, of course, came Europe, Kosovo. Now,
my fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo. This is not war in the traditional sense. It is an attack by tanks and artillery on a largely defenseless people whose leaders already have agreed to peace. Ending this tragedy is a moral imperative. It is also important to America's national interest. Kosovo is a small place, but it sits on a major fault line between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, at the meeting place of Islam and both the Western and Orthodox branches of Christianity. To the south are our allies, Greece and Turkey. To the north, our new democratic allies in Central Europe. And all around Kosovo, there are other small countries struggling with their own economic and political challenges, countries that could be overwhelmed by a large new wave of refugees from Kosovo. All the ingredients for a major war are there. Ancient grievances, struggling democracies, and in the center of it all, a dictator in Serbia who has done nothing since the Cold War ended but start new wars and pour gasoline on the flames of ethnic and religious division. Sarajevo, the capital of neighboring Bosnia, is where World War I began. World War II and the Holocaust engulfed this region. In both wars, Europe was slow to recognize the dangers, and the United States waited even longer to enter the conflicts. Just imagine if leaders back then had acted wisely and early enough. How many lives could have been saved? How many Americans would not have had to die?
Most Americans barely noticed Kosovo. The headlines at home were about Monica Lewinsky. More on that in a minute. Bear with me. But while the public was glued to a freaking melodramatic, ridiculous tabloid sex scandal, Washington was running its first live test of the new doctrine: humanitarian war. Weapons funneled to the KLA, a group that we'd labeled terrorists just weeks earlier. We've seen that before. NATO was bombing Serbia without UN approval. International law rewritten by fiat. And after the dust, the spoils, contracts, pipelines, laundering networks, all folded into NATO's orbit. It wasn't peacekeeping. It was asset stripping with a halo. The Arkansas model. Institutions captured, networks protected, spoils siphoned, now wrapped in NATO's flag. Unbelievable. Kosovo was international proof of concept, my friends, and the neocons were watching and chomping at the bit. By the time Bush Jr. arrived, they could point back and say, see, we've done regime change before, and it works. And the same quiet machinery that Clinton expanded overseas, he was wiring it at home as well. Make no mistake about it. We've already seen how Bill Clinton built a domestic war machine, from Waco to Oklahoma City to FEMA and the 1033 program. But the 1994 crime bill was where that machine turned inward, hardwired into everyday American life. On paper, safety, all about safety, national security. In practice, it was the biggest cage ever built around Americans. Billions for prisons, 100,000 new cops, 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, militarized police on every corner. You know where this is going, right? Slave labor 2.0, the reinvention. This didn't reduce crime, of course, in any way. It recast citizens as enemies of the state, particularly black communities and minorities. And Clinton didn't just sign it, he campaigned on it. He flew home mid-campaign to oversee the execution of a brain-damaged black man who saved part of his last meal for later. That is a true story. How's that for justice? Is it? No, it's not. It's theater. It's a cold signal. Clinton would kill to win, and everyone should know that by now. And then, of course, there's the Telecom Act. Have you ever heard of that? Clinton did so much damage. It's just unbelievable. 2 years later, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, all right? Now, this was sold as competition, okay? It was delivered, monopoly, radio, TV, cable, internet. It collapsed into a few conglomerates friendly to power, okay? Independent media was strangled. Local voices disappeared. The checkpoints were now corporate, easy for government to tap, much easier for them to control. Now, modernization? No, that was a cover. That was the front. This was infrastructure for control. It was the nervous system of the surveillance state. While prisons and media were locked down, Clinton's deregulation fused pharma, insurers, and hospitals into corporate cartels. Gee, that's kind of what paved the way for 2020, isn't it? The rise of trillion-dollar healthcare giants wasn't born in 2020. It was born in the 90s. And what looked like reform was a cartelization. It was consolidation, my friend. Clinton handed public health to the monopolies, and in the process, he laid the foundation for today's biosecurity surveillance state. Unbelievable. No one was scrutinizing Clinton's foreign adventures or his domestic war machine too hard at the time, okay? Because all eyes were glued to something else, something much more salacious, something that was, too hard to ignore. When Whitewater investigator Robert Fisk was finally pushed out for conflicts of interest, Kenneth Starr was supposed to be the closer. He was handed the broadest mandate any special prosecutor could ever want. Probe Whitewater, Madison Guarantee, and the Rose Law Firm. The whole Arkansas machine. He had the green light to follow every lead. My God, I hope he took out life insurance. 6 years, 5 independent counsels, nearly $100 million in taxpayer cash. Leave it to the Clintons, man. Even the investigation turned into one of their grifts. Only the Clintons. And no smoking gun ever emerged. Now, smoking cigars, that's what Billy Boy was into. Enter Monica Lewinsky. She was 22. She was a White House intern. She gushed about her crush on the president to her friend Linda Tripp, who, wouldn't you know, was secretly taping every word. Tripp even convinced her not to dry clean that now infamous blue dress. Keep it, she said, as insurance. Ha! Unbelievable. The whole thing smelled like entrapment. Or maybe just a Gwyneth Paltrow candle. I don't know. One of the two. And just like that, the probe got a whole new meaning. The files and the finance trails disappeared from the headlines, and they were replaced by nicknames like Monica Gate, Sex Gate, Tailgate, Zippergate. You take your pick. Clinton went on TV, wagged his finger, and declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." And for months, parsing that one line became a national pastime. It still is, let's be real. And Hillary, for her part, rolled out on the morning shows to dismiss all of this as a nefarious plot. Damage control. That sucks. I'm sure she was used to it by then. Okay. And then the real Clinton move. Distraction by missile strike. Of course, when in doubt, 3 days after his grand jury testimony, Clinton bombed the Sudan and Afghanistan. Officially, it was a retaliation against al-Qaeda. Unofficially, straight out of Wag the Dog, period. The impeachment circus rolled on, of course. Starr filed his report. The House voted to impeach, and the Senate let him skate. Clinton lost his Arkansas license, but he kept the Oval Office. In the end, The machine didn't need to collapse at all. It proved it could take a hit and keep on grinning. And Monica was just the main showgirl, my friends, backed up by a rousing chorus line. There was Jennifer Flowers, spelled with a G, the lounge singer whose taped phone calls almost ended Clinton's first presidential run in 1992, forcing him onto 60 Minutes with Hillary right by his side. Notice the pattern here? Huh? We haven't even gotten into Epstein. Paula Jones. Remember Paula Jones? It's the Arkansas state worker who sued Bill Clinton for sexual harassment, a case that cracked the legal door wide enough for Starr to pull Monica into the spotlight. There's Kathleen Willey. She was a White House volunteer who said that Clinton groped her in the Oval Office the very same day her husband was found dead. What are the odds? Huh? There's Juanita Broderick. Okay, that was the nursing home administrator who first denied, then years later alleged something much darker. Rape, dating all the way back to 1978. NBC did Bill a solid, delaying the airing of her taped Deadline interview long enough to let Clinton skate through his impeachment hearings. So kind of them. And then came the sideshows. There was Travelgate. You all heard about that, right? The Clintons clearing out the White House travel staff and sliding contracts to their cronies. That was cool of them. Filegate. Somehow hundreds and hundreds of FBI background files on Republicans landed right on Hillary's desk. Go figure. There's Hairgate. That's Air Force One shutting down a runway at LAX so Bill could get a $200 Beverly Hills haircut. True story, yo. Meanwhile, the Whitewater crowd paid the tab. Jim McDougal died in prison. Susan McDougal stonewalled the grand jury and did 18 months for contempt and earned herself a last-minute Clinton pardon. Loyalty rewarded. In the background, the Compromat whispers. Israeli intelligence, rumored to have their own Lewinsky tapes, floated as leverage. You all heard that, right? And it wasn't just the spooks. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu personally leaned on Clinton to free Pollard. Clinton didn't cave. The intel chiefs threatened to quit if he did, but the message was clear. Presidents live or die by their appetites, and foreign allies know exactly where to press. Back then, Clinton drew the line, but look around today. The line has been erased, my friends. What was once an arm twist is now an embrace. The surrender, it seems, is complete. Have you seen Trump pulling out the chair for Bibi Netanyahu? And here's the cherry on the sundae. Time magazine named Bill Clinton and Kenneth Starr Men of the Year in 1998. That should tell you everything you need to know about that magazine, while Mark McGuire was dubbed Hero of the Year. Only in that decade would the impeachment duo share a podium, and the hero, later embroiled in a steroid scandal, peak 90s, even the home runs were juiced, of course. Let's talk about Epstein in the West Wing, shall we? Bill Clinton's presidency was not free of scandal for 1 second of any of the 8 years, okay? So maybe it's fitting that one of his most frequent White House guests was none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah, we've all heard about how many times he visited Jeff, but have you all heard about how many times Jeff visited him? Probably not. At the time, of course, hardly anyone noticed, but years later, visitor logs told the story. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just flying the Lolita Express. He was walking the halls of the White House, not once or twice, but more than a dozen times, sometimes with Maxwell by his side. Go figure. See, back then, it barely registered. You know, it was just another door, another donor, another hanger-on in Clinton's galaxy of exotic and strange billionaire friends. But hindsight made it look very different because those visits weren't just about parties or photo ops. Epstein wasn't a tabloid curiosity yet, you understand? He was still what he'd always really been, a broker, a fixer, a man whose real currency was access. The tabloids would later obsess over the sex, but the real story was networks Epstein service. Do you understand? Let me say that again. The tabloids obsess over the sex part of it, but the real story was the networks Epstein's service, the pipelines of money, the arms, and the leverage that he found in Clinton as a willing partner. The fact that the same candidate star who tried to nail Clinton in the 90s later showed up on the Epstein's defense team? Do you think that was coincidence? No. It was continuity, my friends. There's always continuity. And in the periphery, the body count just ticked and ticked and ticked. Upward it went. Mark Middleton, the Clinton aide who walked Epstein into the White House, he turned up dead decades later, hanging from a tree by an extension cord. A shotgun blast in his chest. No gun in sight. Just another case of Arkancide. Epstein's shadow over the Clinton presidency wasn't just about sex. That was the smoke. The fire was access, networks, blackmail, machine running just out of view while the public stayed glued to the circus and the dog and pony show. And in the spotlight, Bill Clinton proved to be bulletproof, didn't he? He thrived. I mean, we've all seen the pictures of him getting massages, waiting for the Lolita Express. There just seems to be no destroying the man. And instead of destroying him, scandal made Clinton even more popular. Americans shrugged. Who doesn't love phone sex and Big Macs, I guess, right? This was December 1998. The very month the White House impeached him, Clinton's approval rating hit 73%. It was the highest his presidency had ever seen. Proof that scandal did not hurt the man, it actually made him stronger. Starr's probe never exposed the core corruption. Whitewater, Rose, ADFA, Mena. But a bombshell 2016 FOIA request revealed just how close the Clintons' house of cards came to tumbling. Prosecutors had quietly concluded they had enough evidence to indict Hillary Clinton. Now, they didn't pull the trigger, of course. Instead, the files stayed buried and the headline stayed on Bill's escapades, and their dynasty survived, of course. They still have their foundation, don't they? But the Clintons didn't just survive the scandal, they alchemized it. They turned crisis into capital and manipulation into muscle because that's what they do. That's the legacy, the circus, the gaslighting, the blame game. Politics as theater. Scandal not as liability, but as armor, a playbook. The whole political class is still running today, every single day. Step back and take a look at everything we've been saying, and the picture actually begins to sharpen. You see, Clinton wasn't an outlier. He was a link in the chain. That should be abundantly clear by now. He was a machine forged by the men who came before him, refined and scaled under his watch, and he did a fantastic job living up to their expectations and creating new precedents all on his own. That is why he is so rich right now and still so free. George H.W. Bush was the scion, okay? Born into power, bred in oil and intelligence, fluent in the quiet language of the establishment. He drew up the blueprint. Clandestine wars, financial pipelines, a security state with no off switch. That's the end zone. Clinton was the ambitious backwoods outsider, a boy from Hope, Arkansas, with the hunger to climb, but none of the pedigree. He didn't design the machine. He proved he was willing to drive it no matter the cost. From Waco to Kosovo, from the crime bill to the body count, he showed the system could run on autopilot. Fueled by covert money, laundered wars, and scandals timed to keep the public distracted. Together, they locked this formula in. They showed how successful it was, how fail-safe it was to use over and over. The patrician set the foundation. The ruthless upstart put it to work. And out of that unholy pairing came the modern era of chaos we are still living in today. Forever wars normalized. No one even bats an eye anymore. They've been going on for so long everywhere, funded by the United States one way or the other. Surveillance state normalized. Media completely captured. And a public trained to mistake scandal for substance. And that, my friends, is the Bush-Clinton dynasty in a rather large nutshell. But I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Faust Checho, reminding you to please like, subscribe, share this video. This information is important. This video will be extremely suppressed by the algorithms, and I'm dependent on you guys to share this, please, everywhere you can, because we do so much work to put this information together for you. And if the public knew, if 10% of the public knew, if 25%, 50% of the public knew this information, it would change the way they understand the setup in the government, and we could start to make true systemic changes. But most people don't know. So I'm asking you guys, please like, share, subscribe, leave me a comment if you enjoyed this. And also, I have a Patreon page where you can go and support me if you appreciate my work and you want to be part of a growing, spiritual, freedom-loving, truth-seeking community with really cool merchandise. Please check out my Patreon page. And as always, my friends, question the answers. Much love to you and your families. God bless you.